Okay, this is History 117, World History 2, okay? And we're doing chapter 21, which is the New Worlds, the Americas, and Oceania. I don't want to go too much into details. I'm not going to touch the Australia and Oceania explorations. I've never seen them in a world history textbook before. But mainly I want to talk about the Americas, North and South America, and the way in which Europeans moved in on those areas, okay? I want to use my blackboard. I promise that one of these days I'll get into the 20th century and I'll be able to do this all on the computer, although I'm not terribly comfortable. I just don't know these things, all right? For the Americas, you have Christopher Columbus at the very end of the 15th century, 1492. And then throughout the 16th century, throughout the 16th century, and you can't see that, can you? It's the Spanish and the Portuguese. All right? The Spanish mainly in the Americas, although eventually they will get, like in 1571, Magellan sails into the Philippines and kind of claims it for Spain. And Portugal is mainly in the Indian Ocean, although they do have a section of South America in Brazil, okay, where sugar is the main crop. In the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese sort of set up this protection racket. They don't have the resources to control shipping in the Indian Ocean, so they come up with this system that uses a what they call a cartaz, which is basically a permission slip to sail your goods around. And if you don't have the permission slip, which you have to buy from the Portuguese, they'll sink your cargo. Okay, it's kind of a rough business, right? So that's the 16th century, the 1500s. Towards the end of the 1500s, at least the English start to explore in North America, but they don't have any permanent settlements. The 17th century is really the century of the Dutch. Okay? We don't usually think of the Dutch as being very powerful imperialists, but they are. They're great, excellent seamen. They've been going out on the North Sea and gathering up herring and stuff like that to feed themselves. In the 17th century, they kind of take over the slave trade. They do establish colonies in North America, in New York, New Amsterdam, and some in the Caribbean. There's a couple of islands in the Caribbean that they get, and a little sliver of South America, Dutch Guyana. But mainly they're making their wealth off of shipping other people's stuff around, okay? They also move into the Spice Islands, which we call Indonesia today, and basically set up plantations to grow, cloves and cinnamon and all sorts of spices. Okay. They don't institute slavery per se, because technically the people working for them are not owned by the Dutch, but they do impose this kind of coerced. They force people to work on these plantations for either no money or for very little money. It's the distinction between that and slavery is very slim, very slim. Also in the 17th century, you get the British founding colonies in Massachusetts, 1620, and then before that in Virginia, in Jamestown. I think it's 1607. The early days of these colonies are very. Jamestown has a very difficult time. To the point where they, well, it's kind of brought on themselves. The adventurers that showed up there were not workers. They were not farm workers, and they really didn't. They thought they would find gold all over the place, which they didn't. So there's one winter where they're starving so badly they kind of dig up people that have died and use them for food. Kind of gross. What else about the Dutch? I think that's basically it. But they get very wealthy in that century. They do really get wealthy. They basically push the Portuguese out of the Indian Ocean and establish themselves. In the 18th century, it's the French and the British. Or English. I'm not sure when they become the British. All right. France has colonies in Canada, Quebec, and Montreal. They claim a large part of what's the continental United States today. The whole interior of the country. They get Haiti and Martinique in the Caribbean, and they're competing with the British for the slave trade. In Africa, they have trading posts all along the coast of Africa, and in India, they're jostling with the British in India. Okay, I don't know what's happening with the Dutch at that point. The Spanish are pulling hundreds of thousands of tons of silver and gold out of South America. It's not staying in Spain. It's kind of passing on to the English and the Dutch, who are financiers and manufacturing countries. Okay. And this is something, a point I like to make that the book doesn't make. It's kind of tied to this idea of explorers. Let me sit down for a second. A couple of people, when they wrote about Columbus, said that his mission was to find new lands. That's not true. He thought he knew where China was, and he thought he was going to China. When he gets to the Americas, he actually thinks he is in China. Nobody's sure if he knew that. He does 4 voyages, and nobody's really sure if he was clear that it wasn't China. So there's that. So he's not an explorer. He's not somebody searching out new lands that they didn't know about. He's on his way to China, and he accidentally comes in contact with the Americas. It's luck, basically, okay? It's further luck, the early settlers in the Western Hemisphere, colonists in the Western Hemisphere, have no germ theory of disease. So when the Aztecs start dying from European diseases that they have no immunity to, the Spaniards assume that God is taking care of things for them. But that's another act of luck. If the Aztecs and the Incas and the other Native Americans had immunities to those same diseases, there's no way, a small group of Europeans, Spaniards, or whoever would be able to take over those areas. They weren't able to take over China until the middle of the 19th century, and even later in Africa. Okay, so finding the Americas is an accident and a stroke of luck. The whole situation with immunities, which allows them to take over areas of the Americas, is an act of luck. And then finding hundreds of thousands of tons of gold and silver, was an act of luck, a third act of luck. Okay. Now, so there's that. There's this whole thing of explorers, and I put a thing in the course content about words and using words. There are some people like, I don't know, Henry Hudson doesn't seem to do much murdering of people. He just sails up the Hudson and comes down. He's working for the Dutch and claims the island of Manhattan, parts of upstate New York. Other people sail down the St. Lawrence River between the United States and Canada. They're all looking for a way to get to China. They're not interested in North America. They don't even recognize that it has value. They're all looking for a way to get past the Western Hemisphere and get to China still. But the Spanish are certainly not. Once they decide that they're going to colonize this part of the world, they're no longer explorers. They're conquistadors. They're conquerors. They conquer Mexico. They conquer Peru. They conquer the islands of the Caribbean. In many cases, between the diseases and the brutality, the whole Native American population is extinct, is killed, is wiped out, and so exploring is kind of like a very peaceful. It's what Dora does. Dora the Explorer, and she never kidnaps anybody and imposes slavery on them. She never steals people's tons of gold and stuff like that. She doesn't kill or rape or anything like that, and that's what exploring sort of calls up. Okay. On the question of rape, I had this when in the summer I sometimes teach. I didn't do it last summer, but this summer rather. But I teach the first half of U.S. history, and it says in here. Let me see if I can find it. It says European men outnumbered European women by at least 10 to 1. All right? So very few women. Very few Spanish women. Okay? There's lots of Native American women. He says intermarriage, often forcible, became frequent between Spanish immigrants and Native women. And before long, the population of the colonies came to be dominated, numerically at least, by people of mixed race or mestizos. Okay, mestizos are Spanish, usually a Spanish father and a Native American woman. But I want to ask you, what does intermarriage, often forcible, mean? Intermarriage? A man and a woman? Is that the inter? No, it's races. That's the intermarriage. Okay? And forcible marriage? What is that a euphemism for? Okay? And I went and got this because this book sort of says the same thing. The Traditions and Encounters book. And I just, I don't know what to make of it sometimes. At least in one section, it's talking about the same thing, the fact that in South America, there's a whole class of mixed people. Right? Now, this is very different than in North America. There are mixed people, but they don't have a different status. If a white European male has children with an African woman, that child is African and stays a slave, inherits slavery from their parents. In the French and Spanish and Portuguese colonies, it's different. Those people have different status. The mestizos, mulattoes, etc. But anyway, it says here, let's see, migrants to the Iberian colonies were overwhelmingly men. About 85% of the Spanish migrants were men, and the Portuguese migration was even more male-dominated than the Spanish. Because of the small numbers of European women, Spanish and Portuguese migrants entered into relationships with indigenous women, which soon gave rise to an increasingly mestizo, mixed society. Now that's very interesting. Entered into relationships. What does that mean today? You dating? Did they date Native women? Take them out to dinner and a movie? I don't think so. Did they set up households? Probably in some cases. In some cases, there might actually have been an attraction, between Spanish men and Native women. But I think in a lot of cases, it just amounts to rape and sex slavery. You have to really kind of see that it's not entering into a relationship when a Spanish man takes control of a Native American woman, right? So there's that. Now the British and the French, there's something else in here that I wanted to hit on, I don't know. The British and the French engage in a whole series of wars at the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century. There's a Queen Anne's War, a King William's War. Eventually, it'll be the 7 Years' War, which they call the French and Indian War in North America. And these wars are fought all over the world. Some of the 7 Years' War is more of a world war than World War I. Okay? World War I is basically limited to Europe. The 7 Years' War is fought in Europe, in India, on the coast of Africa, in the Caribbean, and in North America, in like New England and Canada. Okay. These wars cost much money, and both France and England are struggling to figure out a way to finance these kinds of wars. Remember, I talked a couple of sessions ago about the bourgeoisie, and you tax the bourgeoisie, and then you pay for a standing army and stuff like that. Well, it becomes more and more complicated the more expensive it becomes. And in fact, war becomes the reason that you develop certain financial structures that promote capitalism, promote the state debt or public debt, and these kinds of things. But at the end of the series of wars, at the end of the 7 Years' War, which is 1763, France is defeated. And France has to leave Canada. I think they have to leave all of North America, but they come back at some point. They're out of India, and I think they lose control of the slave trade on the coast of Africa. And England like stands as the chief imperialist power in the world. Okay, they have colonies in North America, in the Caribbean. They have Barbados and Jamaica and the Bahamas. There's a British Guyana. In Africa, they don't have colonies, but they have control of the slave trade. And in India, it's the same thing. They've kicked the French out. They're the only imperialist power in India, and they're sort of on their way to making it a colony. All right. I think that's really all I wanted to cover today, and it's 20 minutes, so I'm getting better. There's a lot of details in here that you can pick up on. The way the Spanish deal with the Native Americans. At some point, there's a question put to the Pope, and I don't know which Pope it is, but the question is, can Native Americans be enslaved? And the reason this comes up is because the ordinary Spanish nobles and conquistadors want to exploit the labor of Native Americans. But there's also a whole bunch of Jesuits and Franciscans and these other orders, religious orders in South America that want to convert the Native Americans to Christianity, to Catholicism, and build communities with them. Okay, there was a movie years ago with I think it was Robert De Niro called The Mission, that played off of this tension between lay Spanish and religious orders. Okay, and the Pope's decision is that Native Americans have souls and therefore cannot be enslaved. So you have to work out other ways to exploit their labor. And one of the things they come up with is encomiendas, where a bunch of a set of Native Americans are sort of commended to a Spanish nobleman, and he's supposed to take care of their spiritual welfare, and they work for him. Okay, kind of like feudalism. The Pope says nothing about Africans. We have to assume that the Pope's positive notion that the Native Americans have souls and can't be enslaved doesn't hold true for Africans who can be enslaved. Okay, and once the populations of Native Americans are wiped out from disease and brutality, it becomes a thing of bringing more and more slaves to the Americas. We'll talk about this more in the next chapter about Africa. But it's an interesting question, and something to think about. Was racism a factor in Africans being chosen to be slaves? Or was it just a question of they were there, they were available as a labor source, and you needed labor over here? Okay, somebody asked that in a class last semester or something, and my thinking is that it was just a question of, where labor was available and where labor was needed. But once you start the system of slavery, in a very short while, you have to start rationalizing it. You have to start saying to yourself, why is this so? Why are these people enslaved and other people are not enslaved? And that's where the sort of racism comes in. You start making up stories about barbaric Africa is, or how Africans are less than, less than human, or all this other bullshit that they cook up. I'm working on setting up discussions. I think we'll have them go for like a week at a time, and the way we'll grade it is, how much you put into it, how much you demonstrate knowledge from the textbook or other places, and how carefully or how well crafted your contributions are. Okay. I'm also trying to learn how to do more. Maybe doing there's a thing called Collaborate on Blackboard, where we would do like a Zoom. It would be like a Zoom class, and of course I'll have to let you know. It definitely will be during one of the class times that 117 is supposed to do. And there's this other thing called Ensemble, which allows me to do screen sharing and stuff like that. I'm pretty good on Facebook, but everything's different in these different platforms. Okay, that's enough, I think. I hope you're having a good time. I hope you're learning something. That's the important thing. And I did have to hand in attendance, and I really didn't know what the hell I was doing. So I didn't really dump anybody from the class. So we'll see how that turns out. All right. Let me see if I can turn it off without getting my thumb in the picture. No, I can't.